Now on to this, delivering the Western Cape crime statistics for the second quarter of 2025-26, Provincial Commissioner Lieutenant-General Thembisile Patekile revealed that over 1,200 illegal firearms and over 32,000 rounds of ammunition were confiscated in the province between July and September this year. The province has been heavily plagued by gang violence and a staggering murder rate with over 77 gang-related killings in August alone. Let's now discuss this with the Gun-Free South Africa research and policy analyst, Claire Taylor. Claire, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this morning. So given the 28.8% rise in firearms that have been seized in the Western Cape during this second quarter, what specific interventions do you believe are most urgently needed to curb illegal firearm circulation?
I think the first thing to do is to look at the crime stats in the Western Cape. And if you compare the Western Cape with national crime stats, you see that it's the only province in which crime increased in the last 2 quarters. We also see that there are particular areas where crime is particularly virulent. And we also see that the number of gun-related crimes is higher than nationally. So, for example, 60% of murders in the Western Cape are committed with firearms, and the average nationally is about 45%. So they have a really, really big gun-related crime problem. And so the recovery of guns is absolutely fundamental. A gun crime obviously cannot be committed unless there's a gun present. So that recovery is important. It's interesting looking at the analysis from the MEC for safety and community safety in the Western Cape. Her analysis is very much that the LEAP officers have made an impact. And while that's true to an extent in the communities in which LEAP officers are deployed, there was a 9% decrease in crime. There was, in fact, overall a 9% increase in crime across the province. So basically all the LEAP officers did was displace the crime. And again, that comes down to the fact that we can't just rely on policing, that we need to recover firearms and ensure that they don't enter communities. But we also need to stop other firearms entering those communities in the first place. And Lieutenant-General Patekile had some really important insights into the sources of guns and what can be done to go upstream to stop gun-related crime in the province and nationally.
I mean, you speak about those LEAP officers, the law enforcement advancement plans, and it was really an interesting analysis in that in the surrounding areas, the crime rate seemed to increase as opposed to where the LEAP officers had been concentrated on. So speaking about those other efforts that need to be made beyond just the visibility of police, what do you think then would be essential for you to be able to spread out resources in order to combat some of that crime?
So I think Lieutenant-General Patekile's comments when the crime stats were released were very interesting. The first thing that he said is that there are 36,000 guns that belong to estates, in that the gun owner has died and the gun has not been, or the guns have not been relicensed or handed in for destruction. So essentially they are illegal guns. They are unlicensed guns that are circulating. And we know that when guns are outside of any controls, they are at particular risk of being lost or stolen or criminally used. And so there has to be a focus particularly on bringing those guns back into the licensing system. General Patekile also said that there are a number of cases where firearm owners lose their firearms, whether through loss, negligent loss, or theft, and they're not reporting that. And we know from crime stats from the police that civilians report the loss or theft of about 22 guns every day. So we actually don't know what the real number is if gun owners are not reporting loss or theft. And then the third source that he identifies is police loss and theft. So on average in South Africa, police report the loss or theft of 2 guns a day. So what this is telling us is that the biggest source of illegal guns in this country are licensed guns that are diverted through loss or theft or failure to comply with the law, in that an inherited gun is not relicensed or handed in for destruction or sold. The final source of guns that General Patekile identified was cross-border trafficking. And he spoke specifically about guns coming in from Namibia. And that is a challenge. We know that we need to tighten our borders. But first and foremost, we have to tighten controls over licensed guns in this country. And that means including concerted efforts to bring inherited guns back into the system.
I mean, you speak about the cross-border, I mean, with over, 100 illegal firearms, including new AK-47s being imported from neighboring countries, like you mentioned, Namibia and Angola. We really need to talk, like you said, about the control measures at our borders, and we need to prioritize in order for these to be prevented. We are looking at a situation currently, not only in the Western Cape, but now in Beggersdal, where 9 people have been killed, 12 are currently on the run. Police are on the hunt for these people who have committed this crime this morning in the early hours in Beggersdal. How do you see an increase in many of these tavern shootings that we are seeing across the country? We saw not so long ago, earlier in the month, that which happened in Salisbury. Again, these are guns that are being used in many of these crimes. How do you think we'd be able to sort of curb some of these incidences if many of these illegal guns, especially those that are coming from other countries, are being used in such crimes?
I think to firstly contextualize the issue of mass shootings in South Africa. So Gun Free South Africa defines a mass shooting as a shooting in which 4 or more people are shot, irrespective of whether they're killed or injured, and irrespective of how many shooters there are, which is important because in America it's often would be one shooter. And so in 2024, we, through media reports, identified 80 mass shootings in South Africa. So it's a huge problem, and it's a problem that we've seen escalate since 2020. Basically, post-COVID, we've seen a huge increase. It's likely linked to the hold on of organized crime that is increasing in South Africa. So, for example, the latest organized crime index puts South Africa as 7th in the world in terms of how serious our organized crime situation is. So it's likely that these mass shootings, or at least some of them, are linked to organized crime. But we also know that domestic disputes, so for example, it seems like the Lusikisiki mass shooting was domestic related. The shooting that you mentioned in Salisbury seems to possibly be around some kind of personal dispute, but it's also difficult to know what all the motives are. What we do know is that guns the ready availability of guns make these kinds of disputes and organized crime conflicts much more deadly. I mean, a gun is designed to kill, and they are 7 times more deadly than any other weapon. So we have to focus on reducing the availability of guns. And that means recovering illegal guns that are already in circulation, but it means closing the taps that are leaking licensed guns into communities and that are being used in these terrible, heartbreaking mass shootings.
Yeah, and you speak of the availability of guns. Are there countries maybe that we could look towards with regards to some of their own interventions in lessening that availability of guns?
So Australia is obviously the best example. We've just seen the Bondi Beach mass shooting that took place. Australia passed strict gun laws after a terrible mass shooting that happened in 1996 at Port Arthur. And following that shooting, they had no other mass shootings until this latest one. And what this latest shooting has shown is the extent to which the gun lobby slowly exploited loopholes in Australia's gun law to accumulate guns. And that's exactly what we're seeing in South Africa. So, for example, you will see people being registered as sport shooters because sport shooters don't have limits on the number of guns or rounds of ammunition that they can own. And so that's a way to accumulate guns. And so Gun Free South Africa is very heartened by the fact that 25 years after the Firearms Control Act was passed into law, there is a move to amend it. And this will both simplify processes. For example, there's uncertainty about relicensing. But there's also an attempt to look at ways to limit the number of guns that people can own to stop this kind of accumulation.
All right, Claire, thank you so much for joining us. It certainly is quite concerning, like you say, that growth apparently in those mass shootings, 80 over the last few years. it certainly is a cause for concern. That was Gun Free South Africa researcher and policy analyst Claire Taylor.